Hey everyone, welcome back to LudoNarraCon. Today I am happy to have a wonderful panel of guests to talk about player choice. Few things are more important to a story-driven game than the writing. This becomes even more paramount when you are handing over decisions to the players, and you have that tension between what players want to do, what designers are guiding them towards. And I'm happy to have the developers of Citizen Sleeper, Times and Galaxy, and Slay the Princess as they can help provide some insight into the process of writing player choice and addressing that tension between all of those things. So let me go ahead and first start by introducing myself. I am Patrick Klubik. I am an editor over at Remap, a website that kind of follows in the footsteps of Waypoint, a project that I was a part of for many years over at Vice. And this wonderful panel are people much smarter, and they actually make games. I just talk about them. But fortunately, I'm here to ask the people that make them what makes it all tick. And so let's go through the panel itself. I'm happy to welcome lead writer and game designer on Slay the Princess, Tony Arias, and co-creator, artist, and editor of Slay the Princess, Abby Howard. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, happy to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
I'm also happy to welcome Gareth Damian Martin, who is the designer of Citizen Sleeper, and was, I think, the first interview that we published over at Remap. So keeping things full circle, Gareth, as we head towards my own 1 year anniversary of Remap.
Yeah, nice.
Itself.
Yeah, good to see you again.
And then we're also happy to welcome Ben Jelena, creative director on Times and Galaxy, whose name I hopefully pronounced correctly after Ben so kindly sent me a YouTube video of a hockey player with the same last name, and now I'm hoping Ben is going to tell me that I followed protocol correctly and pronounced his name correctly.
Yeah, I'm just glad you didn't say Jelinas, because that was what that was the awkward high school rhyme. I'm Ben. Thanks for having me too.
Excellent. Well, before we get into sort of a broader discussion on sort of player choice and how each of you approaches these different ideas, I wanted to talk about your individual projects. And Ben, I mean, because you're already worried about your name, I feel like we can go first with you. And now I'm just glad because I can just call you Ben throughout the rest of the conversation instead of referring to how I phonetically wrote down your hockey version of your last name. But Times and Galaxy is, I'm going to read from the Steam description. Embark on an interplanetary adventure as the first robo-reporter for the Times and Galaxy, the solar system's most trusted holopaper. You're just an intern, but if you can get the scoop, write great stories, and impress your colleagues, maybe you'll get to keep your job. So in Times and Galaxy, you do a lot of narrative shaping. You're building stories, you're publishing them. We certainly live in a time where narratives are pretty important, often manipulated. News is not always well funded. I can speak to that as someone that lost their job in news semi-recently. What did you want players to feel in that game's central mechanic where you are building and shaping narratives and then sort of presenting that to the universe?
I mean, it kind of came out of a bit of annoyance, consistent annoyance when I worked as a reporter before I got into games, with the how reporters were and the news gathering and journalism in general was depicted in all media, not just in games, where it's very sort of focused on the act of getting news rather than what it takes to actually report the news. So what I wanted to do was kind of put the player in the perspective of a young journalist who has an entire event in front of them, and what are they going to do? How are they going to tell the story? What story are they going to tell? There are so many stories to tell. So they just like a smorgasbord. I can't pronounce that. A smorg of choices, and they get to decide whether to make it a little more informational, or as we used to call it, broccoli. The city hall stories, the stuff nobody wants but needs to eat, or consume. I guess you don't eat news.
Speak for yourself.
I simply get the newspaper every day with a fork and knife. And
That's why you get it at breakfast time, right?
What do you do with the coffee and the newspaper? Reading it seems preposterous.
And just dip it in there, and yeah. So I mean, I wanted to sort of turn news gathering into a game mechanic.
What did you find about your personal experience in reporting? What did you find that you thought were misconceptions about that process that you wanted to illuminate through players thinking about stories, not just as like I listen to these characters pick dialogue choices, but I'm actually constructing a narrative out of that information?
I mean, I think that in general, there's this view from some people that, journalists are out there trying to find a specific story that they already have decided in their brain is the story. And I think, I mean, our game is goofy as hell, right? Like it's not like super serious and very political, but it sort of overall implies for the player that they're actually sort of they're the will of what's going on around them is actually a lot more powerful than what they are trying to do. So depending on what people say to them, or what happens or what is happening, it changes the way that you might see this story. You might go in thinking one thing, and especially with a press release versus boots on the ground, it's a completely different situation. And there's no one story that you could tell, so you have to make a lot of hard choices.
I wonder for the rest of the panel, have you found, similarly to Ben here, that in your own works, Citizen Sleeper, Slay the Princess, that, I don't know, things that happened in your life, like Ben, speaking to being a reporter, and that sort of informing sort of how he wanted to frame his mechanic, its relationship with the player. Did any sort of like real life narratives then intertwine with your own like game narratives that you wanted to offer into both those games?
Well, Slay the Princess is based off an actual time loop I was stuck in for 1,000 years.
I didn't want to come out and say it. I was hoping you would get there. Gareth, is there anything about Citizen Sleeper that kind of was born out of?
Yeah, I mean the whole thing really, apart from it being a emulated Android, similarly not like a time loop, didn't happen. But I mean, Citizen Sleeper came a lot out of my own experiences, kind of trying to live and survive off gig work and being in a city and. Kind of like also like playing life on hard mode with the combination of kind of like gig work plus depression plus everything else kind of simultaneously happening in a very expensive city. And so Citizen Sleeper draws a lot on kind of that experience of just trying to assemble like a group of kind of like friends and jobs and places you go and things you do that might look like a life if you just keep doing it enough times. That's kind of where Citizen Sleeper emerged from, is that experience of precarity that I think I kind of recognized from my earlier life, but also then in other people's lives. And I think I became aware that it was kind of a generational experience in a way, the experience of kind of precarity and not having really fixed structures that feel like they're going to hold you up and carry you through life, but instead you've got to just kind of make it out of the pieces.
Did you find that, putting so much of, I mean, that sounds like deeply, personal, given your experience with gig work, I don't know, how do you ride that fine line where like wanting to invest yourself personally in the work without, like putting so much of yourself on the page and then sort of in some way an extension in the hands of the player? Do you find that satisfying, or do you find it like, I don't know, like you want to draw a line between like how much of you are really like authorial, like personal biographical experiences into those choices and those ideas that then goes into Citizen Sleeper?
Well, it helps when you're writing about a robot that lives on like a spinning ring space station. There's like a diffusion of fact into fiction that kind of like makes it feel comfortable. But I think also Citizen Sleeper was slightly an experiment in for being more vulnerable in my writing, because it's not something I'd done in necessarily games before. It's something that I'd maybe done in other writing. And I was like, okay, why not just... I think the first thing I wrote in Citizen Sleeper was like the initial like in darkness bit that happens at the start of the game, where it's just really a description of like what it feels like to wake up in a body that's not your body. And that was just me kind of riffing on the idea of the sleeper and just putting in all of the things that I kind of felt about my own body and about what physical experience. So the weird thing about Citizen Sleeper is I did invent a robot in order to try to talk more about being human, which is a really weird way around. But it's actually like, if you wrote something about a human where you talked so much about how weird your body was, I think people would be like, this is not what fiction is usually like. But if you're like, no, this robot's body is really weird and I'm going to talk about how weird it is, then everyone's like, okay, cool, that makes total sense. Like, I can relate to that. So, yeah, it kind of like, I like to say it's kind of like a refracting mirror, right? Like using that kind of science fiction setting meant that I could approach things maybe even more closely than I would if I was writing like raw fiction, where I might be a little more afraid to be so honest.
And Tony and Abby and Slay the Princess, which it's good to know that it's based on a real life time loop. That's informative, I think, to the audience. But this is a game where the player dies over and over again. Lots of video games are about death, learning from it. But can you talk about how, as writers, designers, you conceived of kind of the death loop in your game and the player's relationship with it? Because obviously very upfront in the game you realize the player is going to have a very active and participatory relationship with the concept of death as they progress in the game.
So death, I think, is a really interesting challenge with horror games in particular, where for horror to be effective, there has to be this dread of the unknown, there has to be this feeling of external consequences, and something that I think anyone who's played a bunch of horror games is familiar with is the experience over the course of playing something of, well, there's a threshold where you die enough times that you become numb to it, right? It's just like another game mechanic at this point, and it loses all of its narrative weight. So like in our other game, Scarlet Hollow, something that we've done, and that's an episodic horror game, kind of similar in that it's a choose-your-own-adventure visual novel. We're like halfway through that. There isn't an opportunity for the player to die, and all of the consequences in the game are measured either in ways that permanently affect the player through the rest of the story that they have to deal with, or things happening to other characters. So with Slay the Princess, the initial kind of premise we were constructing it over, which was, you're sent to kill a monster that takes the form of whatever you believe it to be, and in this case, it's pitched to you as a princess. It's a very dangerous creature. You would probably die very quickly. How do we incorporate death as part of the story without making it feel immediately numbing? How do we give it narrative weight? And setting it within a loop where you respawn, but everything that happened prior to that respawn still happened and is part of the continuity of your story, felt like the most effective way to tackle it, and it let us tackle death more directly as a narrative subject instead of just, a failure state for the game.
Yeah, and death is definitely a major theme in the game, but I also think another theme is like relationships and the way that one can be shaped just by a few choices that you make early on. Like, your first impressions really matter, so a big branching point in the very beginning of the game is whether or not you go downstairs with a knife or not, in which case you have assumed she is dangerous if you go down with the knife, and so then she interacts with you entirely differently. She has fully different voice lines, and she's basically a different person than if you don't go down with the knife, in which case she's nice and she's sweet and she's more like a princess because you've assumed already that she is not as much of a threat as you've been told. So it's kind of based around how your perception of someone can, in fact, shape the way that they are when they interact with you. And I think this carries over into real life. Like, there have been situations where I have seemed like an entirely different person to someone just based on the way that they treated me the first few times we interacted. So it's an interesting thought that the self you think is, like, fully you is much more malleable in the eyes of other people. The selves that live in other people's heads and the people that you, like, actually know personally, you never really know someone completely, so I think that's a huge part of the game.
That's why everyone should move to a different city at some point in their mid to late 20s.
Become somebody cooler or worse. You never know which
Shed the
one.
shackles of your past.
So we have like death. We have what is self, the relationship between identity and bodies. My game has a cat that's made of goo.
My game
How
has
did
a
I get on
cat
this
too.
panel?
Don't worry, it's not made of goo, but it has a cat. So
No cat owners.
I just
Birds?
we also did the robot protagonist. I'm so sick of human protagonists. To be honest.
Why is that, Ben? Like, it sounds like you kind of made that choice deliberately. Like, why sick of human protagonists? Why pick a robot?
I mean, there were a couple of reasons. One was it allowed every player to kind of put themselves more directly into the role of our player character without us having to spend a lot of money on a character creator, because this is hard. It's hard, and I wanted to, I really want players to feel like they are present in the worlds that I'm creating in games, and it also gave us an opportunity to tell a story that feels a little bit othering, in a way that, like, you're the first robo reporter in this society where robots are mostly performing physical tasks or very sort of straightforward logical tasks, and you're being challenged to think critically and kind of push what people think is possible of a certain type of being in our fake weird solar system.
One thing I think is interesting about all of your games, and Ben, you'll have to inform me how this works or doesn't work in Times and Galaxy, but there's a really interesting relationship between death, failure state, the concept of game overs in Slay the Princess. That is also true in Citizen Sleeper, a game that like constantly has the player feeling as though they're juggling a million different actions that can all fall apart, including yourself. Ben, how does that, is there a tension there where the player can fail or like not achieve like a goal in Times of Galaxy, or is it less existential than that?
I mean, I come from AAA, and specifically, like, I was at BioWare for a bunch of years. I've done a lot of writing with choices and huge consequences, and Times is sort of taking it a little more small scale and making it feel like the choices are smaller in terms of consequences but build, and spoilery, I guess, a little bit, but depending on how you frame your stories, you can increase or decrease your reputation, increase or decrease the readership of the paper, and as it goes along, it changes the way that your colleagues see you. But then in the final cycle, there are consequences to the way that you have reported. But there's no wrong answer. There are different things that happen depending on whether you're moving sensational and you're like upping the readership, but tanking your reputation, or trying to be the most like serious space newspaper possible, and nobody wants to read you, but you're being super responsible. There may be some layoffs in some cases. I'm sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, your robot's coming to take my job. We're talking about layoffs. Like, very realistic depiction of my future. At least, hey, now I'm part of a worker-owned publication. So when I fail, I'll fail because I messed it up, and like that's a better place to be. Ben, in Times of Galaxy, you mentioned how like the arc of the player's kind of decisions are do you surface those consequences? Like I guess what I mean, like in a game like Citizen Sleeper, for example, right? Like there are very concrete sort of like meters being filled that are telling me about the progress of my actions. I'm rolling a dice, so to speak, in order to see how those consequences play out. Like, how much do you surface the consequences of players' actions, and like, how does that rub up against wanting to hide some of what's happening underneath, what's being calculated by the designer, so the player isn't necessarily always surfacing that part of why they're making a choice?
So when you're building the story itself, we have sort of it's a story builder, we call it, build a story, where it's this reverse or inverted pyramid, and you're choosing, the headline, the lead, the nut graph, key quote, and then a piece of color based on everything you've gathered in a particular level at a particular like event. And those are kind of, they're attached to a certain angle. This is a sensational lead, this is an informational lead, and so as you're building those, you're picking those 5 elements out of however many that you've collected over the course of the level. Generally what type of angle you're taking with your story. Then once you've actually filed your story, you can see what effect that has on your readership and reputation as a result. And it's not one-to-one. It's not like if you are doing a super sensational tabloid-esque story about this alien sex curriculum announcement, which is a story in our game. It might actually, depending on the specific sensational elements that you've picked, it might actually help your readership and your reputation. And we have like a Reigns-esque meter for each of those too, so you can kind of chart it over the course of the game, whether your reputation is high or low. The game's long enough that you hopefully have enough time to kind of course correct if you want to. But yeah, it's a lot of sprinkling too, and a lot of kind of I want kind of like reactivity that doesn't feel gamey, where it's just, oh neat, this character noticed that I'm doing a terrible job, right? And I know that I've been doing a terrible job because I've been looking at the data, but they're not going like, oh, I saw your graph for how your reputation is doing and it's looking low. You might want to top that up. It's a lot trying to make it feel like you're being seen in the setting in sort of little ways that then steamroll into something bigger.
We do something similar in Scarlet Hollow, our other game. Sorry to talk about our other game.
No, go right ahead.
We have a complicated relationship system versus having like likes and dislikes and just kind of, you get +5 hearts for this interaction. Instead, it's just like it's a hidden web of us keeping track of how the character feels about you based on how like, all the axes.
Yeah, so we've got like 10 variables spread across like 5 axes. So we have one that's specifically just measuring like
how
just like
you are, or
surface level friendliness. So it's like, are you just agreeable all the time, or do you like pick a fight with someone? Are you argumentative? And that's held separately from like whether or not you have like an emotional connection with someone, like do you share secrets, are you interested in how they are,
and then we can, as writers, can decide how a certain character feels about whether or not you are, say, trying to brown nose with them, and they see through it because we're the writers and we can decide that sort of thing. So they might not like that you are just constantly trying to agree with them to see if you can get a better outcome with them. So we take away the game component and try to make you treat them like they're people instead of numbers. So
yeah. Something we do a lot of work with in our games is, I feel like, the history of choice-driven games leading up to this point in time has been such that, like, people are at least subconsciously encouraged to be extremely optimal in terms of, like, the outcomes that they get from their decisions, and that said optimal outcomes are very much tied to being a boring, nice guy, goody two-shoes. Which is not necessarily reflective of real life. So we have like a lot of the system in Scarlet Hollow is based around like oh, but if you like push back when someone's being a jerk to you and you like assert yourself, maybe this is a more interesting way to play your character. So this can open up these other avenues with these people in these conversations. We have characters that are pretty much diametrically opposed to each other, so you can only, except for rare instances, really get close to one of them. In Slay the Princess, like, we keep that design philosophy, but we don't use a relationship system like that. But it's one of those things where it's like, we try and make sure that every single major choice a player can make is tied to a meaningful outcome that reflects that choice, and never one that is, like, strictly worse.
Yeah,
Like,
we try not to make, like, dead ends or things that just kind of feel unsatisfying as much as we can possibly
Right.
do, so.
Yeah, it's like for us, good game narrative is like this very complicated, like, four-dimensional shape, and what choices should do is change your vantage point on that shape, so that you're always seeing, like, the same thing. You're still seeing a complete picture, but the angle that you're viewing it from enhances or changes or alters your perception of it.
Gareth, in Citizen Sleeper, like, it's obviously a very systems-driven game. It feels like the player has access to an enormous amount of data on what they're doing, what they're not doing, how that informs kind of the decisions they're making. And then there's also the randomness element. I'm curious how you balance between wanting to surface this information, this data to the player, and how you use surfacing that data in relation to how players engineer and think about their own decisions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting talking about also like internal processes within characters and things like this, because I think in Citizen Sleeper, one of the things I tried really hard not to do is not to surface information that felt like it would remove agency from characters. So not to just represent a character with a clock, because most things that happen in the game are kind of represented with clocks that go in different ways, and you might have two competing clocks, or you might just have one clock, or you might just have a negative clock that's taking time to pass and another one that's being filled manually, or the reverse. And there's lots of different arrangements of kind of clocks that I use. But generally, I try not to represent a character through that clock. There's a couple of examples where maybe like a character's patience with you might be represented by a clock that's ticking over cycles, but only something really as basic as that. Because I think when one of the big things that I was trying to do in Citizen Sleeper was to try to deal with choice in a slightly different way to the way I'd seen it done in RPGs, that to me reflected more how it feels to make choices in a tabletop game, which is that you rarely make choices in a tabletop game through dialogue choice. You basically make them through action and through deciding where you go and what you do. And so Citizen Sleeper, really all the choices takes place in the world. And the side effect of that is also that it allows the characters and the character scenes to not feel like to feel like they can have agency. So there are things in Citizen Sleeper which the player cannot do, and there are kind of quests they cannot complete because of other characters are doing things within those quests, and the player doesn't necessarily have complete agency over the world, which I think is a kind of common and something I don't love in a lot of RPGs, is that feeling that the player can just shove the world around, and that's what meaningful choice means. It means you can basically just make the world how you want it to be. And I really wanted to reject that. Instead, think about choices being about how you apportion out your time and your energy into the world. The idea of kind of turning up for somebody and not turning up for somebody being the kind of key choice in Citizen Sleeper, really. And that becomes a really important choice when you actually, the turning up for is a resource. You don't have an infinite amount of turning up for energy. So you have to kind of like apportion out your energy when you've got it and make choices based on priority of action versus necessarily kind of just looking at the clocks. And so in a way, like even though Citizen Sleeper is surfacing a lot of kind of very mechanical information through its systems, I'm actually asking the player to make choices more on kind of gut and feeling and relationship to the characters, not on kind of like min-maxing all of the individual clocks that are spinning at the time. Or at least I want to play that tension, right, where players may take inefficient actions in order to achieve emotional outcomes that they're interested in.
Ben, I don't want to be entirely reductive, but I do think a lot of when people say the term player choice, I do think a lot of their modern conceptualization of that comes back to BioWare and like a lot of what happened with games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect specifically. I'm curious how you think about like your time at BioWare, that concept of player choice, how that informs how you think about player choice now, given how influential a lot of those kind of decisions that happen at BioWare, I think have informed a lot of not just how a lot of games design player choice in the wake of it, but also design against it in the wake of it to try and, arrive at different paradigms, different outcomes with the player.
I mean, I started my career there, and that's sort of where I learned. I didn't go to game design school or anything. I went to journalism school, and so that was kind of my lesson in game writing, was getting in the trenches and working on specifically that kind of player choice driven narrative. I love how you're describing it, Gareth, is like pushing the world around, because that was very much a frustration that I think I can't speak for anybody else on the team, but for me we were very much like that, the one, the hero who comes to save everything, the shepherd, it sort of takes a lot of the weight out of anything but those major choices. And it's exciting to see other creators pushing back against that and trying to figure out other ways to bring narrative choice into games. I think that the way that I work now, although I sometimes, will still do work for BioWare, I still work in AAA. With my own stuff, I definitely try to break my earlier education. In my head, I go like, this is what I would have done making this game. How can I screw it up here? Like, how can I really make it something that isn't something I've seen before? I have my own pet peeves too with choice in games in general. That binary is something that can be really fun as a game mechanic, but it really can take away from the narrative. It can really take away from the feeling that you're actually engaging with the world in a meaningful way, that the world then is pushing back on you. So I really started to love working with small choice, immediate consequences, where it really feels like you're. I think if you're sprinkling in some small choices and some large choices, it can feel a lot more like surprising, because you're not sure exactly what saying this will mean. And that's real life, right? Like, you go up to somebody on the street and you punch them in the face. Don't do that. But if you did do that,
unless you're a renegade, if you're trying to up your renegade score, it's the optimum thing to do.
Every person will react to that punch in a different way, right? And so you are making that choice, but I think part of the fun is in that surprise, the reaction to it. And if there's just sort of a few choices that you really telegraph what the consequences are to that, it makes it more of a game. And I mean, we're making video games here, but I think having the player feel like they're present in the world rather than reminding them that they have a controller or a keyboard and mouse in their hands really makes every choice, big or small, that much more impactful.
Well, in Slay the Princess in particular is fascinating because as I was revisiting it last night, I mean, part of what's fascinating about is it's the opposite of what you sometimes encountered in sort of a BioWare style game, where as the scope of the production got bigger, in some ways it seems like that informs it becoming more binary, because how do you account for all of these choices? How do you scale a production to account for dozens and dozens of player choice? And in Slay the Princess, especially early on, it's like, I have so many options I can pick to go forward with. It seems like in the case of that game, you're almost consciously pushing against the idea of presenting the player with 2 or 3 choices that then feel like, oh, I can already see the spokes that I'm being funneled down. But when suddenly I have 8 or 9 options I could pick from, well, I don't even. It's a different kind of stress and excitement because I don't even know. I was like, well, can the game really account for all of this? I guess maybe I'll just choose something that I actually want to pick, as opposed to kind of the min-maxing that sometimes goes on in player choice games.
This is a back and forth that we have within our studio where I usually want even more options on the list, and Abby will turn to me every so often and be like, now, do we need this?
Like, sometimes you wind up with like 20 choices, and some of those feel very similar.
No, but there's small
balancing
nuances.
it.
So it's like with a list that has like 10 options on there, and Slay the Princess, for instance, like maybe 6 of those will lead to discrete outcomes, but then some of those extras are there because, like, as a design philosophy, I view player choice as like the key component of self-expression in these sort of narrative-driven games. And if you are trying to, again, break that rhythm people are used to of, I will find the optimal solution and click it. One, like you were saying, the more choices you provide, it kind of overwhelms them. And 2, like, it gets you closer to a point where you can account for everything someone might want to do in that scenario, and they can see themselves in the choices, and they'll pick something like it. So it's like, some common ones we'll go with is sometimes we'll have 2 versions of the same option in a menu, but one of them is tagged as a lie. So you get to decide in the moment, are you being truthful there? Are you being dishonest?
It's a kind of character shaping.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's role play, right?
Yeah. Like in college, I was the over-planning DM, where I would spend a day or 2 before a session putting together the giant laundry list of just giant if-else chart of what people would possibly do in the setting.
And now you do that for a living.
Yeah, and then in Scarlet Hollow, something that's helpful is, again, going back to that relationship system, at least in the earlier episodes when you're still making a first impression on characters, each of those 10 variables can get tweaked by a very small degree with every single choice you make. So it's not... So even when you're, just choosing what optional questions to ask or saying something casual, like, that changes other people's perception of you in a way that over the course of a playthrough can, accumulate into a character treating you very differently, and then that's where that impact comes in. Something we play around with a lot is just unintended consequences for actions, too.
We like to make sure that, especially with bigger decisions, there's always a give and take. It's never just going to be, and here's the funner option, but then here's the good guy option. It's more like, well, here's 2 things, and depending on who you are, you might think one is better or one isn't. And you might also just think both are really miserable. And that's what we're hoping to go for.
Right. And likewise with those smaller decisions that are slowly shaping your relationship with someone, the fact that each of those has an impact is something that feeds into kind of unpredictable consequences.
Yeah.
Ben, it sounded like you had a question you wanted to raise about player choices.
Yeah, I mean, it was how did you go about with your games deciding how much the player could define the personality of their player character at the beginning? I find, like, when I'm working, one of the most important first questions to ask is how much can the player define themselves versus a character that's already existing in the world who has their own personality that is then defined for the player, because that will totally change, whether the player is making choices for themselves or they're making choices for the character they're role playing.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to... Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead.
It's such an interesting thing to play around with. With Scarlet Hollow, we, at the very beginning, have character traits that people can select, and they can select 2, which means... From 7. So that means that they can kind of decide different facets of their personality, and then that opens new options up for them. So that kind of means you are playing as this kind of character who will have this kind of option. And then
We also do have you select a name and hometown in a way that compels a lot of our players to make their at least first character a self-insert, which means that they very much approach the game playing it as themselves, which is sort of the intent there.
Yeah. But then we also have a few limiting factors of you are a little bit of like a sad person. So we've made sure that you also have options later on that's kind of like a further character creation of deciding where you live, like what kind of house you live in, and your job. And all of them are kind of miserable versions of normal jobs. So then we kind of have to be like, you are also really sad right now, and your life is not good. So we have to establish that for people. But then, of course, you're never fully going to be able to reflect someone. So you're never going to be fully have a satisfied user base.
Right.
But that's just how it is.
And then in Slay the Princess, you're given what seems like a complete blank slate at the beginning, but of course, the further you progress, the more you find out the things that are true about your character.
Yeah, it kind of starts as like an assumption of, well, I know who I am personally, but then you discover, in fact, that there are parts of you weren't really aware of that are different than other people, which I think is also a big part of going through life is, having a normal conversation as far as you're concerned, and then the other person gets like a face that's like, oh, that wasn't a normal thing to say, actually. Oh, I see. So you discover something about yourself through your interactions with other people.
And
or you look down at your hands and you have really big claws, and you're like, she doesn't have those, so I don't know if I'm supposed to.
And one of the things we do in Slay the Princess is, like with Scarlet Hollow, at the beginning of the game, we have that character builder screen where you actively select 2 traits, and we do have something similar in Slay the Princess, but it's never something that you consciously choose. You get sort of additional voices in your head which shape the decisions available to you and the world that you're in based on decisions you've already made. This kind of sprung from this concept of, okay, you are encountering a creature of perception. Sorry if you're watching this and you haven't played Slay the Princess, slight spoilers. But you're encountering a creature of perception. How do we, as game developers, get a bead on, like, organically how the player feels in a situation without, like, stopping them in front of a door and being like, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah. So we start with, like, the voice of the hero, who's, like, sort of, the stereotypical protagonist anyone plays in something, and he offers occasional commentary and, will kind of will into existence intrusive thoughts that shape your relationship with the princess and shape the world. And then from there, further decisions you make introduce other voices. So it's a way where it's like the voices are reflective of your actions and the world is reflective of those voices. Such that we're able to kind of build that framework for role-playing without directly asking someone, well, who are you? What decisions are you making? What is your place in the world?
I love that just because it's an interesting way to take you out of it, right? Like, it's so hard to not feel the designer in a narrative game with lots of choices where you think, oh, God, they're making me do this or they're making me do that, of course, and the more you can be like, okay, well, I'm doing this and the characters are doing this back or the world is doing this back, and you're taking the actual creator out of it, because we're not sitting behind the player going like, hey, you should try that way, you should go that way because that's pretty cool over there. We don't know what the player's going to do, right? And there's such a temptation to kind of telegraph that or tell the player where to go, because we're that's where one way to tell the story. But when you have choice, it's the player's story, right? It's not your story anymore.
And then you just have to put something interesting behind every corner. I think Scarlet Hollow is currently 580,000 words. You'll maybe see like 100,000 of them in a playthrough so far. Maybe. Slay the Princess is like 200,000 words. You'll probably maybe see like 20, 30,000 at a given playthrough.
I think in response to what you were saying earlier, Ben, and also connecting it to all of this, I think, you mentioned Shepard and you mentioned that kind of specific, and also the idea of like the player character. And in like Slay the Princess, you're talking about this kind of like separate player character that you don't even know who you are. And I think this idea for me in Citizen Sleeper was very important, that the player character is like has to be different than all the other people in the world. That's an almost accepted reality. And so I think in both my games and in Other Waters as well, I kind of played with this idea that what if the player character is somehow maybe less than the rest of the people in the world rather than more than, because there's this kind of assumption that an RPG central character should be a kind of enhanced version of a normal person. But especially in Citizen Sleeper, I really wanted to play with this, but also I think that encourages, in both my games, I like to encourage the kind of like what I call the off-screen role-playing that is taking place. So in Citizen Sleeper, you know that the sleeper is like a person who has had their mind copied into a robot. And I never tell you like who that person was who had their mind copied into that robot or what their memories are. And I keep it kind of like a gray area where it's like, if you want, you can kind of self-insert and say like, oh yeah, I'm the person who was copied into this robot. Or you can imagine like any kind of person might have been copied into this robot. And also you don't know if you have access to those memories. So some people think of their sleepers as having no memory of being a human, and others think of them as having this deep memory of having been a person. And so I really enjoy, because I don't necessarily... I think I don't fundamentally, like, I'm a designer that believes in like kind of offering all the choices. Like I like to make stuff that's quite thematically has a strong through line, and so I actually try to guide the player through that. And I have a rule that I never give the player a choice that I don't think is interesting. Even if a player might find it interesting, if I personally, as a designer and a storyteller, am not interested in that choice, it's not going to go in the game. And so instead, I try instead to encourage the player to think a lot about the potential choices. And I use all of my dialogue scenes as moments for the player to experiment with thinking about what they might do next. Like, that you don't really make choices in dialogue scenes in Citizen Sleeper, but you might respond to a character in a certain way, and that might then be your way of playing out like, oh yeah, I'm not going to end up like helping that person out because in that scene with them, I basically told them to go screw themselves. But you could totally tell them to go screw themselves and then help them, which is also an interesting story in itself. And I really enjoy having this kind of looseness actually and not systematizing everything. So in general, that's something that I try to encourage through the player character, is this kind of like slight nebulous quality where players aren't really sure if what they did led to the things that happened. But they know they have influence, and they know that there is a space for them to fill with role-playing and with character and with choice. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one like, okay, I made this choice and that led to this series of consequences.
So I have a question. Gareth, this is mostly directed to you, but this is also to everyone. I feel like something that doesn't get talked about enough in narrative design is game balance. And I'm very interested when you were designing Citizen Sleeper, because so much of the agency is poured into these systems and how you allocate resources. And like in your system in particular, like there's going to be people who are very good at figuring out like the underlying math of the system, and there's going to be people who really struggle with that. And how do you approach balance such that like everybody has an interesting or fulfilling experience given the wider range of possible outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most challenging things about making Citizen Sleeper, and it's something that I'm making Citizen Sleeper 2 at the moment. It's a massive part of Citizen Sleeper 2 is trying to affect that, because I balance Citizen Sleeper. I mean, balance, I think it's important. I don't really believe, like, we talk about balance like it's objective, but I think it's really just a choice, right? Like, you balance a game for an audience. You can't balance the game for all audiences. It doesn't exist. So for me, like, Citizen Sleeper 1 is balanced for that second player, I think, more than the first player. Like, if a player is going to min-max it, they can min-max themselves out of the game and they can save it. Citizen
I'm
Sleeper
guilty of
instead.
that one.
Yeah, but Citizen Sleeper is kind of built to slightly like to support the player. I think of myself as a GM when I'm making Citizen Sleeper, and so I'm like, I want to be a fan of my player and I want to keep them playing. So even if they like lose all their dice or their health goes down to 0, they don't die. More things happen. The story keeps going. Things keep rolling. So I'm interested in keeping the player playing, but I agree that it's one of the biggest complaints against Citizen Sleeper is like it's not a massive complaint, but I've seen it regularly, is people saying, oh, I balanced myself out of caring about this game. I like got too good at this game and it stopped meaning something to me. And so that's something that definitely I'm trying to think about for Citizen Sleeper 2 as well.
For me, hitting that point just felt like, oh, I finally built a life on this station. There's stability. I suddenly have the choices to do what I want without worrying about consequences for myself, and the choices I had to make to get to this point are also an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, and that's super intentional, right? Like I wanted to have that initial like burst of tension and difficulty that I wanted almost every player to feel that they just pulled off like that first hour, they just managed to get out of it, and that's because there is no way to actually fail it. But so everybody does kind of feel like, oh, I just managed to get out of that situation and then stabilize. But that's also there to really create that bond between the player and the world, so that having been through that experience with those people in this world, now they have a bit more choice. It's like, okay, now they feel something about the world, so that choice is going to be meaningful.
Yeah, something that we do in Scarlet Hollow on the balance side of things is every time there's an episode, we run a survey in our player base. We see what the pick rate of all of the different traits is. We see among people who have played with multiple traits, like how do they rank them. We see for major decisions, like what the split on those is. And we'll go in, and for the under-picked traits, we'll add additional options to make them feel better. We'll add more fluff to them. And then we also, for our major decisions, like we want them to be agonizing moral choices that have no good answer. And it's like the point of those decisions is as much forcing you through like the intellectual or philosophical exercise of figuring out, well, who am I in this decision and what choice would I make? And that's been an interesting process in terms of tweaking it. Like one lesson that we learned was that in a lot of these scenarios, like whichever character says the last line before a choice gets made will dramatically impact who someone sides with. So it's like in the second episode, there's like a mine collapse, and you can either, during the mine collapse, chase after some other people to get them out, or just leave and protect everyone that you're with. And it was like originally 90% of people went deeper into the mine, and then it's like we just changed the last line of dialogue that people got to be like more in favor of leaving, and then suddenly that becomes like a 70-30 split. In the third episode, you get like, you can have different companions with you in the climax of it, but you get the same decision. And companion 1 wants you to make choice 1 very badly, and companion 2 wants you to make choice 2 very badly. And it's like, if you look at the big picture data there, it's almost a 50-50 split over what choice people make. But then if you drill it down to who their companion was, it was just like, well, the person who wants you to make choice 1, if they're with you, 80% of people make choice 1, and vice versa for the other.
I hate to be the person to put a stop on this, but I'm now getting all of my various 15-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, down to a 3-minute warning. The systems in Citizen Sleeper are beeping at me as I'm told to end this panel. And I want to give everyone a chance to promote their work, what's going on, tell people what they should wish list. Tony, Abby, thank you for being a part of this panel. Where can people follow your work? What should they look forward to next?
You can follow us on most major social media platforms. Blue Sky, Tumblr, both of our games have subreddits. We have a Discord. You can follow us on Twitter. I will not call it the other thing, but I do want to leave very badly. Right now, you can, during LudoNarraCon, pick up Slay the Princess for a 20% discount. We recently released a free update that overhauls the ending of the game, and we have an enormous free expansion slated for later this year that will add about... I guess we added up the voice lines the other day. It makes the game about 35% bigger. Woo!
All right.
The end. Also play Scarlet Hollow.
Gareth, what can obviously wishlist Citizen Sleeper 2? What else do you want to point people towards?
Yeah, I mean, you can also pick up Citizen Sleeper if you want to catch up with what a Citizen Sleeper is and why they are sleeping. And, you know, if you want to dig into my back catalogue, you can also play Under the Waters, where you also play as some other kind of robot type thing who is not a human, a kind of AI who you decide is how sentient you are. So any of those are good. But yeah, wishlist Citizen Sleeper 2, and it will be coming soon, but not too soon.
Ben, what about you?
Times and Galaxy, as of recording this, isn't out in the wild yet. We're just sort of finishing it up right now. So, and that's going to be on all consoles, not like N64, but all like current as of recording this consoles and PC.
And
so
there's a demo out now if people want to check it out.
Yeah,
on
but
Steam.
it's out of date too.
I'm sorry.
No. I mean, it's still representative. It's just that if you play the demo and you're like, wow, this is rough, it's because we made the demo a while back. So yeah, wish listing on Steam helps tell the publishers, fellow traveler, thanks, I love you, fellow traveler, that people are interested in the ridiculous stuff that we're making. And then I'm on Twitter. I've been like pulling away from social media so much in the last couple of years. It's as much as like I know we have to go play our games and stuff. It's just so scary.
We all have to leave. Bad place.
We have to leave social media, and we have to leave this panel. I feel like I heard a cat now that is also playing us out. That's like the final noise I'm hearing. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate everyone's time that took time out of the games they're making, the time that you took to sit and watch this panel. I hope you can follow everything I do over at remapradio.com, and I hope you enjoy the rest of LudoNarraCon.
Yeah,
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.